When we were forming Bellroy, it was like we built this whole pitch. We were originally going to be a bag brand and filled a deck with, outlining the brand and what it was about, and then a number of the designs. And I flew over. I've got friends that are very senior in amazing companies in the US. And I landed there and said, okay, I've got a deck. I'm about to sink a chunk of my life savings in this. If you don't think it's good ideas and really good ideas, I'm going to hate you forever. If you don't tell me that, if you don't actually get candid and say, yeah, this is it, go for it, or no, there's something not right yet. If you hold that back and don't give me that feedback, seriously, our friendship's over. And, not really, but sort of. And that gave them permission to actually give the feedback.
Hi everyone, welcome to episode 158 of the Startup Playbook podcast. I'm your host Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. I'm delighted to have Andy Fallshaw, the co-founder and CEO of Bellroy, as my guest for this episode. Andy launched Bellroy in 2010 alongside his co-founders Matt and Lina with their first product, the Slim Sleeve Wallet, which completely designed the wallet experience. Fast forward to today, and Bellroy is the world's leader in the carry category, having expanded out into multiple different product ranges, including iPhone and AirPod cases, as well as travel bags. And despite having built a large global brand and experienced incredible growth over the last 11 years, they only took on external funding for the first time 2 years ago. In this episode, we covered a wide range of topics, including why Andy's business philosophy is built on taking the stairs rather than the elevator, how to get customer validation when launching physical products, the deliberate and strategic evolution of the Bellroy product range, how to create the right structure and environment to take on feedback, and much more. Without further ado, here is my interview with Andy Fallshaw. Hi, Andy. Welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Andy, I've got so many things that I want to talk about, but you've got such an incredible story with Bellroy as well that we'll dive into. But for those people listening to this podcast that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
You bet. So I'm an engineer, a product designer, and a massive geek in all things business sustainability, and the ways that we can have a more positive impact on the world, on its people, animals, and the planet, the environment itself. So I came out of working design in the UK for a little while. Did 4 years with Rip Curl, the global surf brand that was just enormous fun and informative, and learned so much through that. I ended up managing a couple of divisions there, their global board short division, as well as their global equipment division. Learned a lot, but at the end of 4 years, I was feeling like I needed to work on something that would make a more direct impact on the planet. I actually come out of a wheel making family. So Fallshaw Wheels and Casters is a business that my grandfather started making perambulator wheels, and then my father took over and moved it into wheels and casters under hospital beds, high-end equipment. And in that business, I was lucky enough to work my eldest sister, who runs it these days, but also my brother, Matt, and his partner, Lina. They'd been through university together, both engineers as well. And we'd really enjoyed working together in a family business. And so as I was sort of looking for the next stages, Matt, Lina, and myself said, let's start some business failure rate. And so we said, what if we start about 10 businesses and see if any of them take off? And so at one stage, I think we got up to 9 businesses. It was crazy, silly. In hindsight, I wouldn't recommend it to anyone else. But of those businesses, the one that was always a passion project for me was thinking about the space of bags and luggage and wallets and all the things we came to think of as carry. So the way you carry things through the world with you. At that stage, that wasn't a title used to describe the space. So people would describe travel or bags and luggage or accessories. And so in 2009, we launched Carryology, which was the study of carry. And that continues to be a thriving campfire for people to come around and talk about carry and discuss the best carry. And then in 2010, we launched Bellroy. And we launched it with slim wallets. We could see that wallets were just built the wrong way. From my time at Rip Curl, I knew why. I knew how the industry sort of outsourced the design to factories and suppliers, and they were mostly licensed product without designers really thinking about them from the ground up. And so we launched with 5 wallets in August 2010, launched online and in retailers. And from day one, it was international sales. We got some great blog coverage. We were in press, started selling, and started doing that and just iterating, just really trying to understand how customers were experiencing the product, what they were liking, what they weren't. And after sort of a slog for, I'd say, 18 months of just really hard work, we were seeing glimmers of real traction, glimmers of love, but it was hard work. We were juggling the other businesses. We were just torn, mortgages, everything, trying to make this all work. But about 18 months in, we cracked some ways to show ads online and take people through a journey, I guess, explaining how our products were so different. And we then went through, just some rocket ship years of growth of many hundreds of percent. And then finally got to start to expand that out beyond wallets and introduce phone cases and key covers and bags and even luggage. So started to really fill out that carry category and what we thought it could become. So I guess that's a quick summary. We're driven by a sense of trying to make the world better. Matt, Lina, and myself share the same approaches to our philanthropy as well as business. So we are a B Corp since 2015. We try and do things in the most considered positive impact way we can. Our staff and crew are just sharing on that sort of for-purpose approach. And so we also use Bellroy as a platform to try and move positive change into the world in many different ways, either directly supporting incredible groups or through promoting better practices and sharing that. And we just keep iterating, keep evolving, keep trying to understand how we can add value in the world and give kind of intriguing, interesting customer experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And for anyone listening, obviously you can tell that there are so many different streams and avenues that we can potentially explore off the back of this interview. But Andy, one of the things that I'd love to sort of touch on that you mentioned is, obviously Bellroy started with your brother and sister-in-law as co-founders. You mentioned that your family has been running Fallshaw Wheels and Casters that was started from your grandfather as well. For me personally, I've mentioned this on the podcast, entrepreneurship or kind of running business wasn't ever really thought of as a career. But I guess for someone that, essentially grew up with that as a family business, just really curious to understand what were some of the lessons or experiences that you picked up that helped shape how you think about business or particular approaches that you take and implement into Bellroy today?
So many rich themes there. I just incredibly lucky. Like the Fallshaw dinner table was known as a very challenging place. Sometimes friends would might tear up, but being challenged on what their life mission was and why would you do that, and how else could it be done better. And so there was always this embrace of really questioning, like, what are you really doing here? It's like, sure, you call it a job, but this is most of your waking hours. Like, what is it you're trying to change in the world? What is it you're trying to achieve? And I mean, the business was like, we were skint growing up. Like, mum sewed our clothes. She also held down full-time jobs. She also contributed to education policy and all these things. Dad was just trapped in the business, working long hours, just trying to survive and build it. And so I think there was a real reality sense that it was never this dream that you hear about from, the people that come out the other end and they're billionaires and everything's great. It never looked like that for us. It looked like hard work and attention to every part of the business and the people and the culture and the communities you're a part of. And so I think there was a sense of a work ethic that you're there to serve your community and your staff and the people, and that when you're a boss, you're sort of at the bottom, not the top. Like, you're there to serve them. They depend on you. If you screw up, they're going to have issues. And so a real sense of that commitment and that service to the people, to the communities, to the customers, I think that was hugely important. I don't think anyone in our family calls ourselves entrepreneurs either. I think there's something around that where you're in love with the idea of businesses, where Dad always called himself a wheel maker. He wasn't a business person. He was a wheel maker. He was an engineer and a wheel maker, and he made good wheels that helped things move. And so I think there was also that approach that even though we started a lot of businesses, it wasn't for the idea of the business. It's because we could see something that wasn't quite in the right shape in the world, or we could see a gap. And so those businesses were always saying, hey, this isn't quite right. Either customers aren't getting the right value proposition here, or there's businesses trying to sort of gain this and trying to rent seek and just control monopolies and make money. And so it was always this notion of business serving positive impact in the world, and that we'd only tackle an idea if we felt like the world really needed that, if it needed to be done better, and no one else was doing it. And so it's like, God, okay, I guess we'll have to try and do it then, because it feels like the world needs this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you just touched on in terms of, solving problems, and, entrepreneurs by nature are people that will sort of identify specific problems as well. I'm sure many listeners like myself have a book full of different ideas, and, oftentimes the best practice and most common advice is pick one idea and just go and work on that. And as you mentioned, as part of the intro, you, Lina, and Matt actually launched with 9 businesses over a span of 2 to 3 years. Really curious to sort of understand what some of the thinking was behind that, and the approach, and how that sort of process eventually led to you focusing on Bellroy as a company.
Yeah, so I think to make a business work, like, your improvement trajectory has to be faster than other people in the space. And so even if you identify a niche, you then have to believe that you can arm up for it and start progressing faster than anyone else who's interested in that niche. And so the businesses would start when we felt we had some insight, and then we also felt that if we found traction, if we understood product market fit and really saw, the promise there, then we'd have the resources and capacity to go at it. So I don't think we would ever try hardware in the tech space, because for that, you need serious investment in dollars. So most of our businesses were thought of as, can we see a way to ramp up in this space where we're not going to have to spend huge amounts of money? Bellroy was started on just under $500,000, which is a lot of money. We were very fortunate to be able to find that to mortgage homes, do those sorts of things. But that got us to a point where we then had a business that could fund its own growth and scale through it. And so each of the spaces, we needed to find something like that. There's another business we're involved with, Radiopaedia, that hosts x-rays, scans. It's essentially the world's largest resource around that space. And that was that a dear friend of my brother's, Dr. Frank, he's a radiologist, and he could see that a company had come in and bought up all the textbooks and jacked the prices on them to insane amounts. And so even in first world countries, it was really hard to be able to afford those textbooks and those cases to sort of build your calibration around diagnosing issues, finding ways. And so he said, there's this way to build a collaborative resource, that here's this notion. We had a lot of programming skills and chops, so we could partner in that. And we realized we could sort of ramp up the approach there without ever needing to sink enormous amounts of money into one thing to find out if it worked. So all our businesses, we were looking for what's the seed of the idea? Can we imagine being able to scale it quickly, faster than the competitors, even without needing massive resources? And then do we think there's something in our own skill set, approaches that will let us keep developing that expertise and keep sort of ahead of what else is happening? So I think there's many lenses we were using to assess those opportunities. And then in something like Bellroy, with cardiology associated to it, it was also incredibly easy because it was my passion space. I'd grown up traveling, I'd work my brains out, save up every cent I could, and then go and ski or surf or adventure or climb or mountain bike sort of anywhere I could. And so I had a lot of understanding around the issues of carrying goods around the world and how to move around the world and how to avoid excess baggage fees and all those things. So the great overlap was when we could see it was in an area we had a genuine interest. We could combine friendships and networks in those spaces because we already had some of that developed. And then we really could see an on-ramp to how to scale that business up without any one stage needing too much risk.
Yeah, it's really interesting to kind of understand traction for businesses, or kind of the beginnings of product market fit, unless if you've really sort of experienced it before. But one of the things that Lina mentioned in my conversation with her as part of the research process for this interview was that from the very first minute of launching the Bellroy products in the world, you could really tell that customers really connected and resonated with that. I guess from your perspective, what was the tipping point for you that made you realize that actually there was a real business and a scalable opportunity behind Bellroy?
Oh yeah, I don't think it came in a single event. I think it was a sort of progressive ramp, and things like this seem so silly in hindsight, right? But when we looked at the wallet, we knew companies were separating every single card in your wallet and treating them in a similar hierarchy. And so every time you separate a card in your wallet, there's some leather and some air in there. And so by the time you folded that all up and put it in your pocket, the cards took up about a third of the bulk, and then air and leather took up the rest. And there was this sort of scary moment where we said, if you could just separate out a few cards that you reach for every day, and then if you could store the rest all together in one section, you just eliminate huge amounts of bulk. And it's funny, when we were doing that, we're like, it's a big risk. Are people actually going to be willing to do this, to store lots of cards together? Or are they going to worry that they'll scratch or they'll wear out or they won't be treated as well? And so there's these sort of design things where you're like, if people are willing to do this, they can get away with a much slimmer wallet. And it was at a time when, we come out of the baggy jeans of the sort of 90s and 2000s, and people were moving into slimmer silhouettes and skinny jeans. And you could see these massive bricks bulging in their pockets. And it's like, if people are willing to store a bunch of cards together, and, we developed pull tabs to help you get them out and make sure it didn't feel too awkward, then we're like, then they can just have a much slimmer carry solution. And so when we saw people just didn't hesitate and we're like, yeah, okay, I'll do that. That was a big truth moment. It's like, all right, that test, that's happening, that's good. But then I think the other thing was just seeing designers and ad copy people and creatives, they just got it instantly. And when you see that sort of lead adopter who's up for challenging conventions a bit more, just embrace it, then that's also a good sign. So we could see straight away that the people we saw buying and engaging with it were often the sorts of folks that we all aspire to be, creatives, architects, all sorts of people that combine sort of a more creative side with a disciplined, get good stuff done in the world side. And so the types of people loving it and recognizing the paradigm shifts in it were the sorts of people where we're like, wow, they're influential people in the world. Like that should roll out. So I think that was another really good moment. And we all had stories of tram rides where you'd hear someone beside you explaining to their buddy how much better this wallet was and why he had to get it and why his wallet was so insanely bulky and he just had to change that. You'd have other times when you'd walk into, rooms of creative meetings and like all these people pulled out of Bellroy when it came time to pay. And you were just like, oh, okay, this is permeating, like there's word of mouth here. So I think that was all sort of happening maybe 5-6 months in through to about 2 years in. I think that's when we were really starting to understand who was adopting it early, and that they were people that we'd consider have calibrated taste. They're good at assessing something new, making their own judgment, and then backing it.
Yeah, I'm really curious to sort of, also sort of unpack the process that kind of led to the first iteration of the product, or kind of really getting that market validation. Because, I guess from a software perspective, there's pretty sort of known ways of validating a particular product idea. So you have wireframes, you go and get, the initial people to sort of sign up, and you can walk through that process. I'm just curious to know from a physical product perspective, in terms of, as you mentioned, taking a big leap with design and whether people would actually like something like this or not. What does that process look like in terms of designing that, putting that in front of customers? Do you do your first production run before you put anything in front of customers? What does that process look like from your perspective?
I love this thread. So, my brother's an excellent programmer, and so we grew up with the engineering. We were already into lean manufacturing approaches, which ended up being part of the genesis of agile development and those approaches. And so we believed in them, and so much product design, the way it was done in the 80s, 90s, even 2000s, was much more take a risk, do all this market research, invest a lot in the design, and then launch it to the world. And we could see that there was a real opportunity to take agile development approaches into a physical product space as well. And so one of the things we do quite differently to many is many people have their designers based in, US, Australia, UK, and they do pretty pictures, send it off to factories. Factories make things, they come back and check them. But we always wanted that rapid iteration in-house. And so we have maker labs in Bells Beach, as well as Fitzroy, our 2 office areas. All our designers are incredible at laser cutting, 3D printing, tinkering, hacking, making. And so we start from very initial sketches. We might fold some things, try them, but then we start making real prototypes that you can get into pockets, onto backs, and you can watch them in use. And so there's so many versions. Like we might go through 25 prototypes before we end up at that final resolution that goes to production. And the whole way along, we've been sharing them with friends who are, calibrated in that space. They're either designers or product people or brand people. We've been sharing them with staff in Bellroy. The designers have been carrying them and using them and interacting with them. And basically every generation, we're trying to bring more and more fidelity to the design and trying to resolve other parts. And so we've really tried to build a process where we get to bring the experience forward in a rough way, but then add fidelity to it as it goes through. We launch it, and then even when we launch a product, I think, one of our first products, the Slim Sleeve wallet, we must be at, 20 something iterations of that product, even after we launched it, because then we try and build rich feedback loops where we're watching how they're being used, we're experiencing it, we're poring over every review, and we're just realizing there's still opportunities to make it better. We can move where that thread finishes and there's less chance of that fraying 3 years down the track, or we can get a thing back and realize it's wearing a bit more on that corner, and so we can shape it so that corner sort of loses some of its prominence and sits back in a bit. And so we just really try and develop very rich feedback loops from both the prototyping stage through to the actual product in the market, and just keep feeding that back into iterative improvement in the product.
Yeah. And I think, while we're kind of on this thread as well, it just a recent Facebook post in a Facebook group that I'm part of reminded me of this, of someone saying, got the survey, no one's kind of completing this survey. How do I get more people to complete, this survey for this new business idea that I have? And I think, surveys are a mechanism to try and get information, but actually what you're looking for is insight. And I don't think that a lot of founders do that really well, especially first-time founders. So really curious when you take this out to influencers or share this with staff, what bits of feedback or what type of insight are you looking to get back to determine, we're on the right track and we need to sort of move towards the next stage of the process versus actually this is really good feedback, but this is probably something that we need to stop and reassess and sort of look at it from a different angle.
Yeah, and I think that's so difficult because products and services fulfill so many jobs in our life. Like sometimes you buy something predominantly because of the way it looks, but then if it doesn't serve the right utility down the track, that starts to get in the way and it tarnishes the experience. We talk a lot about joy and the sort of joy that you build over time is when utility and delight both commingle. And so you're often assessing performance on many different metrics, and you need some way to sort of navigate that. So there needs to be a sense of fitness for purpose. So who is it you're trying to serve, in what sorts of jobs? And then you've got some way to assess the feedback you see according to that. So not all products can be all things to all people. So you need to say, look, the essence, the North Star of this product is to serve these sorts of roles. And there's a bit of a hierarchy in how we might juggle that. And then you can assess to it. But the way you seek feedback, a funny story, funny to me, not you guys form your own opinion. When we were forming Bellroy, it was like we built this whole pitch. We were originally going to be a bag brand and filled a deck with, outlining the brand and what it was about, and then a number of the designs. And I flew over. I've got friends that are very senior in amazing companies in the US. And I landed there and said, okay, I've got a deck. I'm about to sink a chunk of my life savings in this. If you don't think it's good ideas and really good ideas, I'm going to hate you forever. If you don't tell me that, if you don't actually get candid and say, yeah, this is it, go for it, or no, there's something not right yet. If you hold that back and don't give me that feedback, seriously, our friendship's over. And, not really, but sort of. And that gave them permission to actually give the feedback. And James and Paul are two friends that I'll forever feel indebted to, because when we were showing the bags and I ran them through the deck, did all of that, they're like, oh, it's good, but I don't reckon it's good enough. And it's like, oh, okay. And they're like, bags area is noisy. A lot of brands are competing. It's not clear what the performance metrics are. There's not a really clear hook that you have here that's different enough. What else do you got? And it was like, oh, heartbreaking, brutal, poured months of time into this. And it's like, oh, I've got some sketches for wallets. These are pretty different. And sort of show that. And they're like, yeah, that's interesting. But tell me more. And so it's the way you go out to seek feedback. It has to be contextual. It has to really give them permission to unlock and say what's really on their mind. And then only some people can really give great feedback. So you've got to be able to think, where is this person calibrated? Where do they put their attention? What are things they have very calibrated standards around? And then when I seek feedback, it's not worth asking grandma if your wheelie's a good wheelie on your BMX. You've got to go and speak to someone who's actually calibrated as to what a good wheelie on your BMX looks like. So when you seek feedback, really understand, what is it this person can give you rich feedback in? What areas are they calibrated in? And then find ways to tease it out of them that will be as candid and real as possible. And often, if you sit them in a sterile white lab, they'll go into a different mood. It's better, again, if you can actually get the feedback when it's in the environment they're using the product, or in real context. And if you can observe, not just ask, and all those sorts of things are ways of building a more nuanced map about where it's performing and where it's not.
Yeah, I love that. I love that answer and that response. And I think, I think the points that you mentioned in terms of giving people the right sort of permission, but also making sure that you're getting the feedback from the right sources is critically important in getting the right level of insight that founders need to make the right decision for their business. Speaking of product, obviously there's, I think it's pretty clear from speaking to you the level of thought and detail that you put into your products. Specifically, as you mentioned, in terms of almost recreating what a wallet experience would look like for people. But again, one of the people that I spoke to in doing research for this interview was Dane O'Shaughnessy, who you worked with at Rip Curl. He's now the country director for Patagonia. And he mentioned that, one of the things that he finds really incredible about you is the level of thought that you put into your product design. And he gave an example of you creating sort of the ultimate backpack. And he said that, one of the things that he was really sort of surprised by is, most of backpack design is fairly straightforward. But one of the things that really blew him away that was really unexpected was when you kind of open up all of the compartments, the way that the backpack actually sat on the ground, which made it so much easier to use, was something that he said was, incredible experience. But again, not something that most people would associate or think about when creating backpacks. Relaying this back to a lot of founders who are trying to think about, what are the right type of features for me to include into my product, and how do we make this a better experience for our users? I think it'd be really interesting to unpack what your sort of thought process is, or how do you sort of, really both simplify, but also think about how you can make that experience ideally 10 times better for the customer when you're thinking about new products for Bellroy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, there's different business models out there. There's lots of people that have great business success by just copying what's working. It's a famous model in Australia. Watch what the US startups are doing and then spin out a version in Oz and just copy. It's never something that excited me. And so I did a year of study at the Glasgow School of Art under a phenomenal professor, Norman McNally, who this was 99, I think. Yeah, 99. And he was like, when you're trying to come at a space that has had hundreds or thousands of people come at it before, you need some way of seeing it differently to how everyone else is seeing it. And so he was the first one that got me addicted to this notion of mental models, frameworks, maps, ways of mapping behaviors, markets, things. And so you sort of hunt in this space for a bit where you're looking for areas where there's a really underwhelming experience in part of what's happening that most people are a bit blind to. Their concentrations in other places. And so that ultimate backpack, that was, when I came into Rip Curl, they were mostly selling cheap school packs, and it didn't feel right for a company trying to be the ultimate surfing company. And so that's an example of a project where we said, well, what is the ultimate surfing backpack and what does it look like? And instead of starting with a price point of $49.95 or starting with something that's sort of a business framing on things, it was, let's map the journey, let's look at the way you take a surfing backpack through with you on a mission. If you're going to a trip to Indonesia, what are you doing? How are you packing? What's the travel part of that? What's the at destination part? But then if you're buying a beautiful thing, how can you make sure it's useful day to day as well? So you're sort of mapping out these different journeys, and then you're looking at these pain points through the journey, spots that really aren't being done very well. So they're sort of the away goals. Here's some things we want to avoid. But then you also want to be identifying the towards goals, the magical moments, the points when you just truly grab someone in the heartstrings because that was the moment that defined their trip, or that was the moment that they will, hold on to for years to come. And can we support and enhance that moment? And so you're trying to find ways to sort of look at what are away goals that are wrong with things in their current experience, but then you're also trying to look at towards goals, things that can motivate and draw you towards and sort of enhance the good bits. And then you just end up with all these points and you start trying to make sense of them. And so you start saying, well, are there some axes we could use here? And is this wallet storage optimized and this one's access optimized? Or is this backpack sort of all about the crazy weather you'll go through, where this one's much more about how you show up in a workplace and not look silly? And so you start to jumble and move, and then you're looking for a North Star. You're looking for something that will put coherence to all of those different elements you're trying to juggle and move into a conceptual whole that you can hold on to. And so, yeah, you start building out like who's the audience? What are the moments that matter? What are the moments they want to avoid? You sort of paint a map. Then we often use frameworks to sort of help us juggle it and make sense of it. And then you keep stepping back and saying, but does my gut feel, my system one in Daniel Kahneman language, does it believe this? Does it get excited? Does it sort of really want to see this come to life as well? So you're both using some more analytical skills, that sort of system two mind, and then you're also trying to just check your gut and your emotions, and does it get you jazzed and energized thinking about this? And then you show it to others that might have similar problems, and you're trying to get a sense of how they respond and react to it. And it might start with a sketch or a mood board, but then quickly you want to make prototypes that bring that into a more tangible experience realm. So it's involved. It's lots of to and fro. It's lots of dead ends and turnbacks, but you're trying to build this hierarchy of, there's a North Star at the top that captures it, that feeling, that moment. Here's some defining points. And then you're trying to shake a bit of order into all the other things it needs to do below and hold that together in a narrative weave that feels legible and sort of tractable, and that you can wrestle with as you move this concept through its iteration to market.
Yeah, it's really fascinating in terms of like, I guess putting it in another way, like having a very clear North Star vision of what you're working towards, but how you get there, being open to things sort of evolving and changing over time.
Absolutely. And that North Star that should also continue to evolve. Donald Reinertsen, an amazing writer in the agile development space, talks about product development as an information generating activity. And it's this notion that as you take it through development, you should be generating information, learning through it. Like if you already know what it's going to be before you sit down to design it, you're not ambitious enough. You should be putting these seeds of ideas, seeds of experience into something that people can interact with, and then learning, and so that even that North Star should get sharpened and sharpened as you go. I guess in Hollywood, they call it the high concept pitch. And that's, there's all sorts of examples about Alien was sold as Jaws in space. And, there's these ways of how do you build a North Star? Is it some words? Is it an analogy? Is it a moment? Is it an image? The North Star can take different shapes according to the project you're on, and it should keep refining and crystallizing and becoming more exciting as you go.
Yeah, again, one of the really interesting points that Lina mentioned when we spoke was just a really deliberate nature that Bellroy has taken in the new sort of products that it's taken to market. And it not being in accident in terms of the sequence that those sort of products have been released. Thinking about a wallet perspective, as you mentioned, it's something that has a lot of word of mouth, but a lot of the time it remains invisible because it is inside people's pockets. And I think you mentioned that the next sort of product range that you came out were iPhone cases, and then you sort of over time moved into luggage. When you talk about sort of refinement or crystallizing that over time, how clear was that sort of roadmap for you from the early stages, and how much of that was, I guess, taking in that feedback and that sort of evolving and changing over time?
Yeah. It's such an interesting thread. So, when we started, people didn't think of the carry space, and we're aware many still don't. That's sort of our own conceptual framing for the space. And it's great now we can see so many other brands, thanks to the work of Carryology, now think of this as a space. But we knew we wanted to constrain where we were working. We're not luxury goods. That doesn't feel right to us. It's not what we want to work on. We were looking for things to help you move through the world with less friction, greater ease of mind. But we definitely evolved how it looked. I think each time a mate, Professor Simon Bell, talks about this, each time a company successfully releases new product and it gets traction, it gives them permission to then go to the next adjacency. And if they get that, it gives them permission to the next adjacency. But if we had have gone from wallets to perfume, that would have been a very strange one for us. It would have put us in a luxury goods space, and we're not after that world. That's not what appeals to us. So we were looking for, okay, if we've had success in wallets, what else? And so we were like, all right, well, pockets, we were slimming your wallet, which is all about making your pocket less bulky and cumbersome. What else is there in pockets? Well, there's keys and there's phones. Let's start work on that stuff. And as we got that right, it then gave us permission to move to the next section. And it was like, well, the same organizing principles we're doing here matter a lot in a lot of your work things. So there's laptop sleeves, there's folios and pens, there's things that you're carrying with you to take your notes into meetings. What about that? Then when we moved to bags, I think our first bags release wasn't as good as it could have been because we took another risk. We thought people would be up for less pockets and more pouches and organizing in their bags. And we did it, and some of the bags did all right, but they didn't do as well as we would have hoped. And so we realized like our concept, we felt some of these same organizing principles might translate to bags, but it didn't slide into people's minds as comfortably. And so it was fascinating. It's when we came back and started on body carry, like slings and crossbody bags and things like that, they just took off instantly for us. And we realized, well, that was people no longer wanting all this bulky stuff in their pockets. Now they want to carry the same things you'd carry in your pockets, phone, wallet, keys, on your body. And so you realize that that's a much more natural adjacency to successfully solving pocket problems. It's like, well, what about when your pocket's on your body and as a bag that you can take or leave? And then once you're solving those, then it makes great sense. Oh, if we're great at bags, slings, crossbody, it makes sense that we can also be great at backpacks and totes and those sorts of things. And so I think you come in with some principles. Like in carryology, we were trying to define what the carry space is, trying to evolve that and sort of get a forward read on what people could conceptually hold as carry. But then as a brand, you're still testing it and you're trying theories and it's not resonating enough. So you're going, what did we get wrong there? And you're sort of coming at it from another angle. So there was a rough plan, but when it's long distance, it's sort of a bit vague and it's not crystal and clear. It's a sense, it's a direction. And then as you sort of move into the midterm, you get your themes and they start to make sense. And then short term, you get to see the real concrete things. So yeah, we go with a sense, but it certainly is continuing to evolve and tighten as we go and we learn more.
Yeah, one other thing that kind of really stood out to me from one of our previous conversations was the analogy of using the stairs versus the elevator, and specifically thinking about it from a context of how do you build a really sort of long-term resilient business. Do you mind sort of elaborating for the benefit of the listeners what you sort of mean by that analogy, and I guess how you use that as a framework for how you think about building the company?
Yeah, so it was a comment I heard in the background somewhere and I couldn't even place it. I don't know who had said it, but they were just comparing the elevator to the stairs. And we were like, gosh, this actually captures what we think of. So many stories in the startup world are about the elevator to success. It's like, oh, overnight unicorn, VC funded through 100 million at this, then 200 million, then 300, and now they're 1.5s. And isn't this great? And we were saying, when you try and take the elevator to success, someone else is really in control of it. Like whether it's the computer algorithm that's going, now you're going down a floor, now up 2 floors, now you're stopping, now that, or whether it's, the old lobby person in the elevator moving it, someone else is in control. And so it can shoot to the top, but it can also plummet. It can go up, down, everywhere. And we're like, we think of what we do as taking the stairs, where you're building muscle the whole way. You're in control. You can move up several stairs or down a couple. As you build more muscle, you get to move up 2 or 3 stairs at a time rather than 1. And so the expertise in Bellroy is something we're just so delighted to have each day. We have a lot of staff who've been with us for a long time. When we bring new crew in, they integrate really well. And so there's just a lot of muscle in Bellroy. So we do all our tech stack ourselves. It's a fully custom dev site. It's incredible back end automation. We've got our own data teams. We shoot all those videos and photography, and all of that's in-house. It's all skills in the team. We even have our own pattern maker, where so many brands rely on suppliers for pattern making. We've got a world-class pattern maker sitting right in amongst our designers, working with us to make sure that as we're designing, the patterns are being resolved and we're sewing and we're testing. Our product development team understands the production environment beautifully, and so we can simulate what they're doing. We often build tooling in-house and then move it over to suppliers. So it's like, I think that desire to sort of build this long-term platform that's a resilient business that understands the expertise. Like, we outsource third-party logistics because we know we've run warehouses before. It's a different skill. It's not the same skill set. But for most of the skills we do, we've chosen, instead of just outsourcing that to an agency, we've chosen to tackle it ourselves, really get our head around it, and then understand how it integrates with the rest of the business and build better integration, so that as we make plans for our next stages and developments, we kind of understand the real levers and mechanisms behind what makes an ad work or not work, what makes a landing page work or not work. How do you truly influence site speed once you start wanting to do all these other features? And so, yeah, I think it's just, it's an interesting one we've talked about.
I used to run a marketing agency a couple of years ago, and I would get a lot of early stage startups that would come to me and say, we need help with our digital marketing. Can you help? And it's like, absolutely, you can help. And there are trade-offs in terms of, you instead of having to hire a bunch of people, you can hire an agency that has expertise in a particular area. But the trade-off in that is you're often losing a lot of the insight that you're gaining from being able to do it yourselves. And as you mentioned, being really able to understand the levers of what's working, what isn't working, and why behind that. But, again, for a lot of founders, a lot of this is, especially at the very early stages, a trade-off between, the learning versus being able to survive long enough for those learning to be able to implement over the long term. So from a Bellroy perspective, was there were you sort of a completely in-house team from day one, or did that sort of evolve over time? And if so, what did that sort of structure or process look like?
Yeah, so we used a lot of freelancers early, and that was our sort of middle ground between agency and in-house, because a freelancer you have the direct relationship with, you can sort of scale their time up or down a little. And so some awesome people really were contributing. So Jimmy, our creative director, he was there from the first concepting days, but he was still working other jobs. He was still doing other things and just working for us weekends and nights. And then as we scaled up and became a safer sort of place, and he could see there was more to do, he started giving us more and more hours before he became full-time. So I think we've often done that. I think you're absolutely right. Like Fitness for Purpose, we had a hub of different businesses, and one of our businesses was software programming, right? So dynamic language programmers with incredible skills. And so we could get them doing a little bit of time on Bellroy and helping us there. And so it was sort of this hybrid, half in-house, half outsourced, because it was one of our other businesses. And then as Bellroy grew, we ended up sort of folding the teams in and sort of gobbling up many of our other resources and expertise areas in the other businesses. So most can't do that, and we fully acknowledge that. And all those crazy years of doing too many businesses and sleepless nights, like at least that was something we got out of it. But I think you're absolutely right. I think it's really understanding what has to be your core competencies. What are the things you really need to control, and what can you afford not to? So third-party logistics is a great example of that. Like, there's no way we can be world-class at 3PL along with everything else. So it's like, let's find an incredible partner there, work with them, build a close relationship. So I think the other thing is, we still use some externals to come and consult, throw an idea in, try some freelance, keep sort of exposing ourselves to other things. We network, we've got incredible friends in associated professions, and so we brainstorm with them regularly. I think for us, our core competency has to be product design is one of them. And then I think the tech stack that facilitates getting all that content out into the world and telling the stories properly. So we've ended up holding a bit more in-house than most would. Even part of that was just being a product business based in Australia, where most of your sales are overseas. You can't just be a US DTC on Shopify, one product sold to the US market. Like, we had to work out how to sell to the world through multiple channels earlier. And so we couldn't just run Shopify. Like, we launched on Shopify, we then scaled through Magento, but then we had to go full custom, because the complexity of a global business based in Oz, multiple warehouses, multiple currencies, multiple languages, just no custom plugin thing could do that. No plugin thing could do that. So we had to go custom. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Early on, you've got to choose, where do you need to hold that core knowledge and expertise in-house. You can't do it everywhere. Sort of choose your battles. But as you scale, keep questioning, does that now need to become a core competency? I think there's lots of people who begin with ad agencies who reach a point where they really do need to bring that in-house and align the incentives truly with their business. Otherwise, many consultancies have different incentive structures to what the business does. And so you've just got to keep an eye on, when is the right time to say that now needs to be something we should do.
Yeah, and one of the things that you mentioned, obviously there's a lot that you've mentioned through this podcast that I've loved, but just in terms of fit for purpose, like, there isn't one specific way of being able to do that. So, two previous podcast guests that I've had recently, Nick Franklin from Chart Mogul and Ash Davies from Tableau, both of them spoke about, why raising VC money early on was great for their business. But, for the last, 7 or 8 years, for both of them, they haven't gone on to raise external capital. In the case of Bellroy, it's actually been the opposite approach, which is for the first 7 or 8 years of the company, you didn't take in any external funding. But from what I understand, about 2 to 3 years ago, you took on some external funding. Do you want to share why, I guess you decided to make that switch and why it felt like the right time and the right decision for you?
Yeah. And you're right, it's not as common the way we did it, but early on we felt there was enough resource that I think we've always wanted to put Bellroy first. If we serve Bellroy well as a vehicle, it will serve everyone else well. And early on, funding wasn't the constraint, but it was just getting everything right. And I'm sure if we threw more money at it earlier, we could have grown faster. But I think when we were growing at many hundreds of percent, you're trying to hold on and do it. And I think we've always cared about the culture. And I think if we grew even faster than many hundreds of percent, I think it might have felt like it was going to get away from us in the long term. And so we intentionally just sort of kept working with what we had. A few years ago, we knew what that journey was like when you're at 6, 7, 800% growth. And we'd expanded our range, and we were starting to see bags were taking off, work accessories were taking off, phone cases were taking off. And we went, all right, we might be coming back to some really high growth years here. We didn't need the funding, but what we wanted was some people who've been through the journey before, because it was no longer going to be just wallets where, 2 suppliers where we have deep relationships, we have very few materials. Like, wallets is a fairly straightforward supply chain. And it's now like, oh gosh, lots of categories on lots of channels, digital marketplaces, wholesale channels, direct to consumer channels, corporate sales, like so many areas. And it was like, if it would be really sensible and it would be safer for Bellroy if we had a bit more wisdom around the table, like people who've been through these journeys before might see around some corners. And also thought, so we went out, we raised, but it was an incredible time because we didn't have to. And so it meant we could be incredibly patient, and we built the thesis for the sorts of investors we'd want. And it was really about the right expertise. We want, some people in the US, some people in Oz. We want people with experience in our space, people that will just help us see some potential issues ahead and work on them a bit earlier. And then I've got to say, coming into COVID, we were just lucky. It was all closed. Everything was sorted before COVID hit. And for a carry company to come into COVID's a headwind. Like, we make products to help people move around the world, and COVID was like a raging storm coming straight at us. And so in hindsight, we were incredibly fortunate to still have all of that, in the bank. It was all there as a safety net, and it meant we could again play the long game. We didn't have to lay everyone down the way all our competitors were. We could say, no, let's develop through this. Let's be smart. Let's pivot. Let's find the green shoots and go for it. And we managed to sort of ride out that initial hiccup and, get the business back to good growth again. So in hindsight, oh my gosh, so glad we did raise when we did. But I think it was more just for a resilient long-term business, it would make sense to have a bit more experience as we're making these decisions, people with skin in the game, people really motivated to see the right outcomes. And we got to be choosy on who we picked. We could find people that got our for-purpose approach. They knew we were trying to make the world a better place. And so they weren't going to just sort of push for every extra dollar.
Yeah. And, I guess coming back to one of the things that you mentioned at the start of the interview, which was the Fallshaw dinner table was an interesting and a challenging place to be around. And, again, touching on what you mentioned in terms of, seeking that sort of wisdom and that experience around you. Another thing that Dane mentioned, outside of just what you do at Bellroy, is you're a very keen surfer and a skier. But one of the things that he mentioned about your personality is that, you are by nature a very curious person. And, despite being, really talented in these particular sort of domains, you still go out and look for bits of advice from, pretty much from whoever was willing to give you any bit of advice, which, I think from a founder perspective, I know that it can be really hard, and you can get very sort of tunnel focused and just, have the blinkers on. And I think, one of the things that's come out from this podcast is, the best founders are always, willing and open to get the right type of people around them to give them the right types of advice. Do you have any advice in terms of how you sort of go about looking at different perspectives or surrounding yourself around the right type of people that would be beneficial for founders who are looking to do the same?
I think there's a few parts to it. So one of them is, as humans, we all have blind spots. We all have things where our attention's over here and it misses the bit that's here. And that means there'll be areas that we're really strong in and we continue to build strength in. But if we can't put our attention on something, we can't really improve on it. And so I think one of them is a very candid circle of people that can help you identify those blind spots. And that's where I just feel so fortunate in life to have Matt and Lina. Even my wife Mia is incredible for this as well, but having Matt and Lina sharing so much context of Bellroy and what we're trying to do, that we can each have a very candid chat with each other. Like, if we think we're weak somewhere, if we think we're missing something, we'll help the other person sort of understand that, and understand how to reduce that blind spot, understand how to look at it. Each of us also speak to people very regularly. So Paradigm Training in the US is a group that have helped us have people that we talk to regularly, and they help us troubleshoot and problem solve and think about things, and finding a relationship like that. Some people would use a mentor. I think it's very important that it's not a token thing, though. It's got to be someone who has enough context and insight, and they're not just reflecting back at you, they're prodding and pushing and understanding those blind spots and helping you kind of acknowledge them, understand them, and build a path to mapping them. And then I think another part to it is, like, genuinely, can you just overcome all those human desires where, like, feedback's hard. Like, even if you're feeling confident and robust, if someone's saying you're not doing this very well, it still hurts. There's an initial response. Oh God, that hurt. But it's like, have you practiced a method to integrate that and understand that they're coming from a good place and they're goal aligned and they want you to see the benefit? And I think each of us have been very fortunate to build incredible friendships. Like, Dane and I just love getting around, a coffee or a ski hill or something, and just talking about the challenges, the opportunities, the things we're thinking about, how we're framing problems, how we're trying to navigate it. And so I think there's many people that don't really want advice. They're not their ego's not robust enough yet to deal with it. And I think if that's the case, it's always going to be hard to take that on in a genuine way. And so I think there's a lot of personal development you have to do to be ready to take it and want it and genuinely want it. And then you need to find people that genuinely care for your interests and your goals and understanding them and work with you to frame it in a way that you can integrate it and it won't hurt too much and work with it. But it sounds like it's a sort of self-flagellation process, but it's also incredibly exciting when you get traction and you develop and you see you've made progress in areas that you weren't great in before. And then you also still get to keep pushing your strengths and the things that you know you're good at and you can get even better at. And so you keep pursuing sort of world-class friendships, networks in those spaces to keep pushing the edges of your strengths as well and the spots that feel really good. So I think for Matt, Lina and I, it's just part of our makeup. We look for it, we want it. It feels genuine, at least I think it is. And I think we've all just seen our own journeys develop and the progress in it. And hopefully we can keep developing fast enough that all of our crew and staff don't overtake us and we're now holding them back. I think it's that desire to keep serving the people we're working for and with to make sure we keep progressing the same way we hope they will.
Absolutely.
Sorry, that was quite long and there was a few bits to it, but hopefully there was something you could make sense out of.
No, definitely. Andy, I know that, we can talk for all day and I've still got so many things that I want to talk to you about, but just to wrap up this particular interview, we'll definitely have to get you back for round two at some stage as well. But my final question is, you kind of spoken about the need to be authentic and kind of being really aligned. One of the things that we haven't really spoken about is, the real impact perspective that you take with Bellroy and kind of, really aligning it to how you think about the business practice, both in terms of sustainability and the overall impact that you have as a business. Do you want to share, again, how that sort of translates into the business, but also how you sort of think about the decision-making process behind the business as well, in terms of balancing the situations where it might be an easier business decision to go down a particular path, but it's not necessarily aligned with, what you're really trying to build over the long term with Bellroy?
Yeah. Gosh, such rich pickings. I think we do think of ourselves essentially as a values-led organisation, but they're not values that you can easily capture on a wall. We have our values, but they're much more nuanced than that. And beliefs should update more regularly. Politicians are often hauled over the coals for changing their mind on something, and that just seems absurd. Of course you should be changing your mind. Like the things people like us believed 100 years ago are abhorrent to us these days. And the same thing will happen in the next 100 years. The things we believe now will just seem crazy and nuts to others. And so I think it's very important to try and build some alignment around values and what does a better world look like and what sorts of actions and things lead to that. And seek a bit of alignment, but then be very willing to update beliefs about the best way to get there, the way to get there sooner, better, deeper, that sort of thing. Those things need to keep updating. There was a great Yvon Chouinard quote, so founder of Patagonia, and he said, I can only, I'll get this bit wrong, but I can only make so much difference turning off the lights. And it was this notion of just reducing our impact won't be enough. If we can learn how to get better practices to the ground in ways that work in a for-profit business, that work in an economy that has certain incentive structures. If we can develop and learn those ways, we can share them, we can inspire others to them. I think B Corp community is incredible for this. It's a series of businesses trying to work out how do you use business as a force for good? How do you share that learning amongst other like-minded individuals? How do you frame goals beyond just a profit motive? How do you seek tangible measures that you're making progress towards these? And so I think we align on a number of values, and then we keep hunting and looking for better ways to realize those values and help them get expressed in the world more thoroughly. So Bellroy works on sustainability. We do a huge amount on animal welfare. We do a number of things that we think we have a comparative advantage in, that we think we have genuine ability to push the boundaries forwards. And then we try and learn best practice from all the other brands that have other comparative advantages and are pushing boundaries forwards. And so we try and stay really open to that learning. And if someone else has a great idea in something pretty much other than product design, we'll just grab it and yeah, let's go. And so I think it's a sense of a bit of a map, whether that's vision-based, whether that's values-based, of what good looks like. And then it's hunting constantly and saying, are we still on track to realize that vision of good as early as we can? Or is there something we could change that would help us get there sooner? And so as you build more and more people with that sense of how to balance profit with purpose, how to do those things, their influence bleeds out into their communities and their nodes. They get to have conversations with other businesses and help them think of a new way to tackle that thing that would better balance those two things. And then we also get some resources that we can apply directly to some incredible initiatives around the world. So I think it's sort of a movement rather than a 3-stage process or something, but it's that desire to keep genuinely seeing if we could realize a better vision sooner, and that desire to keep questioning and updating as you learn a better way, or you change your belief about something.
Absolutely. Andy, thank you so much for coming on the show and for sharing your experience, insights, and lessons. For anyone that wants to find out more about Bellroy or about yourself, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sign up to the Bellroy newsletter. We try and share things through that email. There's socials. I'm not very good on social. So I think there's, I'm on Twitter, but I don't say much. I think it's more track some of the process. We share journal articles with Bellroy where we've got some incredible sustainability pioneers that we're starting to share some interviews with and that sort of thing. That's one good way. Otherwise, if you're in the B Corp community, there's certainly events we participate in. There's things we do there that you can certainly go that way. Yeah, I think that's probably the best bet.
Perfect. I will make sure all of those links are in the show notes. Andy, once again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on. And
thank you so much for sharing such great interviews and insights and things. I've learned a lot listening, and thank you. Keep doing it. I love it.
Thanks, Andy. Really appreciate it. Thanks for listening to episode 158 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As always, full show notes from this interview will be available at startupplaybook.co. Unfortunately, I'm in the middle of a move right now, so I'm not sure if I will have everything set up in time for next week. But as always, if you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And I will be back as soon as I've got everything set up in my new location. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you at the next episode.